The Meridian Tower was 54 floors of glass and steel rising above the financial district, home to 11 corporate tenants, a private medical clinic on the 32nd floor, and a building management system so advanced that its developers had described it, in the trade press, as the closest thing to a thinking building that currently existed. On a Wednesday morning at 7:14, the thinking building's CEO walked into the facility's control room on the second floor, and found a janitor asleep at a monitoring console. His head was on his forearms. His mop was leaning against the wall behind him, untouched. On the screens above him, cascading lines of code scrolled in patterns that meant nothing to her. She did not ask questions. She did not look at the screens. She looked at the mop. "Security," she said. "Remove him. I want his termination processed before 9. The janitor's name was Calvin Reese. He was 38 years old. He had been awake for 52 hours and 14 minutes, and in those 52 hours, he had done something that the building's entire contracted cybersecurity team minus 12 specialists, $4 million annually minus, had failed to do. He had stopped the Meridian Tower from being turned off. All of it at once with everyone inside. To understand what was on those screens, you have to understand the man who had been watching them for 2 days straight, without sleeping. Calvin Reese grew up in a neighborhood where the library was the most reliable air conditioning in summer, and the most reliable heat in winter, and he had spent more hours in it than most people spend in school. Not because school was unavailable, because the library had no bell, no one telling him to stop, and a computer section that stayed open until 9. He taught himself to code at 13. Not the beginner courses, not the introductory videos. The real thing minus network architecture, system security, the logic that sits underneath every digital surface that people touch without thinking about what holds it together. By 17, he had found and reported 3 security vulnerabilities in publicly accessible municipal systems, minus the kind of quiet, responsible disclosure that security professionals call white hat work, and that most 17-year-olds do not know exists as a category. He was offered, through a program run by a university partnership with a federal cybersecurity initiative, a full scholarship to study information system security. He accepted it on a Tuesday. His mother cried at the kitchen table. He started the following September. He did not finish. His mother had a stroke in the spring of his second year. It was not fatal, but it was significant enough that she could no longer work, no longer manage the apartment alone, no longer do the 100 small things that keep a life operational. Calvin was the only family she had in the city. He came home. He told himself it was temporary, that he would go back in the fall, or the following year, or the year after that. People tell themselves this with complete sincerity, and sometimes it is even true. And sometimes the years accumulate quietly until the temporary has become permanent without any single moment where a decision was clearly made. Calvin did not go back. He found work minus warehouse logistics first, then building maintenance, which paid better and had benefits, and which required at the Meridian Tower specifically, a facility technician certification that Calvin had completed in a single weekend because the material was compared to what he had been studying. At 19, straightforward in the way that a children's book is straightforward to someone who has already read the complete works of Tolstoy. He had worked at Meridian Tower for 6 years. He wore gray coveralls with his name on the chest. He mopped floors. He changed HVAC filters. He replaced fluorescent tubes in hallways at 3 a.m. because that was when the building was emptiest, and the disruption was smallest. He did these things well and without complaint and with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since made peace with the gap between what he was capable of and what he was being asked to do. The building management system, minus the one the developers had called the closest thing to a thinking building that currently existed, minus ran on a platform called NextCore. Calvin had read the full NextCore technical documentation in his second month on the job, because it was available on the facility's intranet and he had found it interesting, and because understanding the system he worked inside made him better at his job. He had read it twice. His supervisor, a man named Derek, who had worked in building maintenance for 22 years, and believed that curiosity about things outside your job description was a sign of professional ambition that tended to Cause Trouble had once asked Calvin why he spent his breaks reading system documentation instead of eating his lunch in the break room like everyone else. Calvin had said that the documentation was interesting. Derek had said that interesting didn't pay extra. Calvin had agreed, and gone back to reading. Outside the building, Calvin was the father of a 9-year-old named Darius, who was quiet and methodical and had recently become fascinated by chess minus, not because anyone had introduced him to it, but because he had found a worn chess set in a box at a school book fair and taught himself the rules from a YouTube video and then beaten his teacher on his third attempt, which had prompted the teacher to call Calvin and say, with the specific energy of someone reporting both good news and a mild personal embarrassment, that Darius might benefit from more advanced instruction than the classroom could provide. Darius's mother had not been in the picture since Darius was 4, there had been no dramatic ending, no single event to point to. Just the slow divergence of two people who had wanted different things and had taken too long to admit it, ending in a quiet separation that left Calvin with primary custody and a complete reorganization of his life around a single priority. Darius came first. Everything else arranged itself around that. Calvin dropped him at school every morning, he picked him up every afternoon, or arranged for his neighbor Mrs. Patterson to do it on late shift days. He helped with homework at the kitchen table, where Darius had recently taken to setting up the chessboard. Beside his math worksheets and moving pieces between problems as a form of thinking, Calvin had learned chess in the past 3 months specifically so he could play with his son. He was not yet as good as Darius, he was however, learning faster than Darius had anticipated, which Darius had noted with the evaluating calm of a 9-year-old who takes competition seriously. The first anomaly appeared on a Monday evening at 11:47 p.m. Calvin was on the late maintenance shift, finishing a filter replacement on the 28th floor, when his facility's tablet minus a basic device issued to all maintenance staff for work orders, and building alerts minus showed an unusual status flag in the NextCore dashboard. It was small. A single node in the building's smart access control network showing an authentication request from an internal device address that did not match any registered equipment in the system's hardware registry. Under normal circumstances, this flag would have generated an automated alert to the building's contracted cybersecurity team minus a firm called Vantage Secure, headquartered 3 blocks away, with a monitoring contract that covered the Meridian Tower's digital infrastructure. Under normal circumstances, the alert had not been sent. The automated notification pathway had failed to trigger minus not because the system had missed the anomaly, but because something had already intervened in the notification layer, quietly. Before the flag could escalate, Calvin saw it because he was looking at the raw dashboard feed, not the filtered summary view that most facilities staff used. He looked at the raw feed because it was more complete, and because completeness, in his experience, was always more useful than convenience. He stared at the flag for 40 seconds. Then he opened the NextCore technical documentation on his tablet minus the full version, not the facility's summary minus, and cross-referenced the device address against the system's hardware registry. Manually, the address did not exist in the registry. It had never existed in the registry, but it was generating authenticated internal traffic, which meant something had gotten inside the building's digital infrastructure, and was presenting itself to the system as a device that belonged there. Calvin finished the filter replacement. He clocked the work order as completed. He rode the elevator to the second-floor facilities control room, sat down at the main monitoring console, and began to look more carefully. What he found over the following 3 hours was not a simple intrusion, it was not a smash-and-grab attack designed to extract data quickly and disappear. It was something more patient and more dangerous minus a sophisticated, multi-stage infiltration of NextCore's core operating layer, conducted with the kind of methodical precision that Calvin recognized from his years of self-directed study as the signature of a professional operation rather than an opportunistic one. The attackers had entered through a software vulnerability in a third-party elevator management module, minus a component that had been flagged for a security patch by NextCore's developers 4 months earlier. The patch had not been applied. Calvin checked the facility's maintenance log, and found the patch notification unopened. in a shared inbox that nobody on the facilities team had the technical background to understand or the authority to action. From the elevator module, the attackers had moved laterally through NextCore's internal network over a period of what Calvin estimated from the traffic logs was approximately 3 weeks minus moving quietly, establishing footholds, testing access boundaries, learning the system from the inside in the same unhurried way that the most dangerous intrusions always proceed. Their target was not data. Calvin understood this. Within the first hour of his investigation, their target was control. NextCore managed everything in the Meridian Tower. The elevators, the HVAC, the fire suppression system, the smart access doors on every floor, the backup power routing, the emergency lighting, the private medical clinic's environmental controls on the 32nd floor minus temperature, humidity, the precise atmospheric conditions required for the storage of medications, and the operation of sensitive diagnostic equipment. Everything. A complete NextCore takeover minus the kind the attackers were methodically building toward minus would give whoever held the controls the ability to lock every door in the building simultaneously, disable every elevator, override the fire suppression system, cut the HVAC to the medical clinic, plunge 54 floors of occupied building into a condition of complete remotely controlled helplessness. Calvin sat with this understanding for approximately 4 minutes, then he began to work. He did not call Vantage Secure immediately. This was a decision he made consciously, and for a specific reason. The notification pathway that should have alerted Vantage had been compromised. Whoever was inside the system had already demonstrated the ability to intercept and suppress automated alerts. Calling Vantage through normal channels risked alerting the attackers that their presence had been detected minus causing them to accelerate their timeline rather than abandon it. He needed to understand the full architecture of the intrusion before he moved against it, or the response itself could trigger the attack it was trying to prevent. He worked alone, on the monitoring console through the night. He mapped the lateral movement pathways the attackers had used minus the precise route from the elevator module, through the access control layer into NextCore's core operating system. He identified 6 active footholds, 6 points in the system where the attackers had established persistent access that would survive a standard reboot or patch cycle. He began, carefully and in sequence, to close them, not aggressively, not in a way that would announce itself as a defensive action. Each closure was disguised as routine system maintenance, minus the kind of low-level housekeeping that a facilities system performed automatically on a regular schedule, and that the attackers, monitoring for defensive responses, would not register as a threat to their operation. It was Calvin would later describe to a federal investigator with the particular economy of someone choosing words precisely, like removing someone's hands from the controls one finger at a time while they're still watching the dashboard. The first night became the second day. Calvin called Mrs. Patterson at 6 a.m. and asked if she could take Darius to school. He said there was a situation at work. Mrs. Patterson asked if everything was okay. Calvin said it would be. He meant it. He simply did not yet know how long it would take. By noon on Tuesday, he had closed 4 of the 6 footholds. Each closure had required navigating NextCore's legacy code architecture, minus layers of software accumulated through years of partial updates, written by different developers at different times with different priorities, held together by a logic that was internally consistent but required, to fully understand, exactly the kind of deep, patient, comprehensive reading that Calvin had been doing quietly for 6 years. The 5th foothold was the most technically complex. It had been embedded in the fire suppression module's authentication layer minus not as a simple backdoor, but as a conditional trigger, a logic chain that would activate automatically if certain conditions in the building's status were met. Regardless of whether any human operator gave the command, Calvin spent 4 hours on the 5th foothold. He ate a vending machine sandwich at his desk, without tasting it. He drank 3 cups of coffee from the facility's break room. His eyes had developed the particular dryness of sustained screen exposure and insufficient blinking, and he had begun to notice, in the background of his concentration, the specific weight of a body that had not slept. He closed the 5th foothold at 4:17 p.m. on Tuesday. 1 remained. The 6th foothold was different from the others. It was not embedded in a module or a subroutine. It was sitting in NextCore's core authentication layer, minus the deepest level of the system's operating architecture. The layer that governed the master access credentials for every function the building could perform. Closing it required generating a complete re-authentication sequence for the core layer minus a process that in NextCore's technical documentation was listed as a Level 4 administrative function requiring dual sign-off from the building's facilities director and its contracted cybersecurity provider. Calvin was neither. He was a janitor with a facilities tablet, sitting at a monitoring console in the second-floor control room, 41 hours into a shift that nobody had authorized, and that nobody in the building knew was happening. He spent 2 hours finding a legitimate pathway through NextCore's administrative architecture that would allow him to initiate the re-authentication sequence without the dual sign-off minus not by bypass. The security requirement, but by identifying a legacy administrative pathway that predated the dual sign-off protocol and had never been formally deprecated in the system's code. It existed because systems like NextCore always contained these pathways, minus old doors, built by old architects, left unlocked because nobody had remembered they were there. Calvin remembered, because he had read the documentation twice. He initiated the sequence at 6:43 p.m. on Tuesday evening. It ran for 4 hours and 31 minutes. At 11:14 p.m., the sixth foothold closed. The Meridian Tower's NextCore system was clean. All 54 floors, every elevator, every door, every environmental control, the medical clinic on the 32nd floor. The backup power routing, the fire suppression system, all of it intact. All of it secure. Calvin sat back in the chair. He looked at the screens. The screens showed green across every monitored system, minus the clean, even green of a building that did not know how close it had come. He put his head down on his forearms. He was asleep in under 40 seconds. Elaine Marsh had been CEO of Meridian Property Group for 7 years. She was 52, precise in the way that people who manage large assets become precise minus attentive. To numbers, to presentation, to the visible signals that communicate competence to the people whose confidence she depended on. She arrived at the Meridian Tower every Wednesday at 7 a.m. for her standing walkthrough, minus a self-imposed discipline she had maintained since her first year as CEO. On the principle that the distance between an executive and the physical reality of what they managed was a kind of blindness she refused to develop. She walked through the lobby, the common areas, the service corridors. She pushed open the door to the second-floor facilities control room at 7:14 a.m., and she found Calvin Reese asleep at the monitoring console. She saw the gray coveralls, the name on the chest, the mop against the wall behind him minus placed there, nearly 53 hours earlier, when Calvin had sat down at the console with the intention of looking at one flag for a few minutes, and had not stood back up. She saw the screens above him minus the cascading lines of code, the system logs, the status indicators that were every single one of them, green. She did not know how to read the screens. She had never needed to. She saw the mop. She called security. She called HR Chow. She gave the instruction in the flat, decisive tone of someone who has made a quick assessment, and has no reason to question it. When the security officer touched Calvin's shoulder, he surfaced slowly minus the particular surfacing of someone whose body has been pushed past its limit, and is fighting the return to consciousness. He lifted his head, his eyes were red, his face creased from his forearms. He saw Elaine Marsh. He understood immediately what was happening. He opened his mouth. "Marsh," he said, "the building has been under a cyberattack for—" "I don't need to hear anything," Elaine said. She was already looking at her phone. "Security, please escort him out." "Derek," minus she said to the facilities supervisor who had appeared in the doorway minus, "I want this console station reviewed. I don't know how long he's been in here." Calvin looked at her, not with anger, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 53 hours preventing a disaster, and is now being asked, by the person whose building he has just saved, to leave. He said, "One more thing." Quietly, directly to Derek rather than to Elaine, "Do not reboot the NextCore system. Whatever you do, Not until Vantage Secure has reviewed the core authentication logs from the last 48 hours. Derek looked at him. Elaine was already in the corridor. Calvin picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He did not pick up the mop. He walked out of the building into the sharp morning air and called Mrs. Patterson and asked if Darius had gotten to school okay. Mrs. Patterson said yes, that Darius had packed his chess set in his backpack this morning for some reason, and that he had asked her to tell his dad that he had figured out the defense problem they had been working on last week. Calvin said to tell him that was good, that he'd look at it when he got home. He sat on a bench outside the building, and looked up at 54 floors of glass and steel in the morning light. Then he went home and slept for 11 hours. The next core reboot happened at 9:47 a.m. Not because Derek had ignored Calvin's warning. Derek had, in fact, passed it along to the facilities director, who had passed it along to Vantage Secure's on-call team, who had assessed the situation remotely through their standard monitoring interface and determined that the system was showing no active alerts, and that a routine reboot to clear any potential irregularities was a standard and appropriate response. The on-call technician who made that determination had been with Vantage Secure for 14 months. He had not read the NextCore technical documentation beyond the sections relevant to his standard monitoring duties. He had not seen the core authentication logs from the previous 48 hours because they were not part of his standard monitoring view. He initiated the reboot at 9:47 a.m. Calvin had closed 6 footholds. He had cleaned the system completely. What he had not been able to do what the re-authentication sequence had been designed to prevent was remove the attacker's ability to re-enter through the original vulnerability in the elevator module, because that vulnerability was a software flaw in a third-party component, and fixing it required a patch that could only be applied by NextCore's developers, not by a re-authentication sequence run from the facilities console. During the 53 hours Calvin had been working, the attackers had been locked out. The footholds were closed. Their access was severed. The reboot reopened the door. Not slowly. Not gradually. The moment NextCore came back online, the elevator module vulnerability was live again, and the attackers who had been monitoring the system continuously, waiting for exactly this moment, were back inside. Within 4 minutes, this time they did not move carefully, they did not establish footholds methodically over weeks. They had been waiting for 53 hours, they knew the architecture. They moved directly to the core operating layer with the efficiency of people who have studied a building's floor plan, and are no longer interested in the quiet approach. At 10:03 a.m., the elevators in the Meridian Tower stopped. All of them, simultaneously. 3 people were inside elevator cars at that moment. The emergency intercom systems, which ran on a separate power circuit, still functioned but the cars themselves were locked at their current positions, doors sealed, going nowhere. At 10:04 a.m., the smart access doors on floors 14 through 27 locked simultaneously. 41 people on those floors found themselves in offices and corridors they could not exit through the standard doors. Emergency stairwells, which operated on mechanical rather than electronic locks, were unaffected but nobody on those floors knew that yet. Because the NextCore status displays on those floors were showing system messages that the facilities team would later describe as deliberately confusing messages, designed to make occupants uncertain about which exits were safe. At 10:06 a.m., the environmental control system for the medical clinic on the 32nd floor received an override command. Temperature regulation for the medication storage area began to shift outside the required parameters. At 10:07 a.m. Derek called the facilities director. The facilities director called Vantage Secure. Vantage Secure's team, now fully online and looking at a system in active compromise, began the process of understanding what they were dealing with. It would take them, their team lead would later estimate in the incident report, between 6 and 8 hours to fully map the attack architecture and develop a remediation strategy. The medical clinic's medication storage had a maximum safe temperature window of approximately 4 hours before irreversible degradation of critical medications began. Elaine Marsh was in a board meeting on the 41st floor, when her assistant appeared at the glass door with an expression that caused Elaine to excuse herself before the assistant had finished King. She stood in the corridor outside the boardroom, and listened to her facilities director describe, in the compressed and slightly unsteady language of someone delivering information they do not fully understand what was happening to her building. She asked 3 questions. She received 3 answers that did not comfort her. She asked for Vantage Secure's projected timeline. 6 to 8 hours. She looked at the window at the end of the corridor, minus 54 floors of glass and steel, visible from the inside, a building full of people who could not get where they needed to go. She asked one more question, quietly. The janitor, she said. The one from this morning, he said something about the system before he left. The facilities director was quiet for a moment. He said not to reboot it, Derek said from somewhere behind the facilities director. Elaine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Find him, she said. Now. Calvin's phone rang at 10:31 a.m. He had been asleep for 3 hours. He surfaced from the deepest sleep he had experienced in years, minus the specific absolute sleep of a body that has been refused rest for long enough. That when rest finally arrives, it arrives completely minus, and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Meridian Tower main line, he answered. The facilities director's voice. Tight, professional, and carrying beneath the professionalism the specific frequency of controlled panic. Calvin listened, without interrupting. When the facilities director finished, Calvin asked 2 questions. He asked for the current system status and the timestamp of the reboot. He received both. He was quiet for 4 seconds. The medical clinic on 32, he said. What is the current temperature in the medication storage room? The facilities director checked, gave him the number. Calvin looked at the ceiling of his bedroom. You have approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes before that storage room reaches the upper threshold, he said. Tell Vantage Secure to stop trying to remediate the attack from the outside. They need to give me remote access to the core authentication console and stay off the system while I work. If they run remediation simultaneously, we'll conflict each other, and lose time we don't have. A pause. Who are you? The facilities director said, not rudely. With the genuine bewilderment of someone who is recalibrating very quickly. I'm the janitor you fired this morning, Calvin said. Can you get me the remote access or not? He worked from his kitchen table. Darius was at school. The apartment was quiet. The chessboard was on the table beside his laptop. A game in progress, the position Darius had left for him to consider. Calvin did not look at the chessboard. He looked at the screen. Vantage Secure's team, lead minus a woman named Sandra Park who had 17 years of experience, and the particular focused calm of someone who has managed crises long enough to know that calm is a technon. ACL requirement, minus granted him remote access to the core authentication console at 10:48 a.m., and then, as Calvin had requested, pulled her team off active remediation, and watched. What followed was not the same work as the previous 53 hours, that had been methodical, careful, patient. This was faster and more direct, minus not reckless, but operating with the compression of someone who understands both the architecture and the clock. Calvin did not reclose the footholds one by one. That had taken hours the first time. Instead, he went directly to the core authentication layer, and initiated a full credential rotation minus a deeper process than the re-authentication sequence he had run the night before, one that would not only close the existing footholds, but invalidate the attacker's access tokens entirely, forcing them out of the system, at every level simultaneously. The process required, at one point, a manual override of a NextCore system protection that was designed to prevent unauthorized core-level modifications, minus a protection that existed, correctly, to prevent exactly the kind of access Calvin was now performing. He bypassed it. Using a legacy administrative pathway, the same one he had used the night before, the one nobody else had remembered was there. Sandra Park, watching the remote session from Vantage Secure's monitoring interface, later described the moment Calvin initiated the credential rotation as watching someone perform open-heart surgery on a system I've been working with for 6 years. Using a door I didn't know existed. The credential rotation completed at 12:19 p.m. The attacker's access was severed at every level. Every foothold, every token, every pathway invalidated simultaneously, with no re-entry possible through the elevator module vulnerability because Calvin. In the 40 minutes between the credential rotation and the vulnerability patch that NextCore's developers pushed at 1:02 p.m. on Vantage Secure's emergency request, had manually isolated the elevator module from the core network a temporary measure, inelegant, but sufficient to hold the door closed until the proper lock arrived. At 12:21 p.m., the elevators began moving again. At 12:22 p.m., the smart access doors on floors 14 through 27 unlocked. At 12:24 p.m., the medical clinic's environmental controls returned to automated management under correct parameters. The medication storage temperature had reached 73% of its upper threshold limit. It had not crossed it. Sandra Park sat back in her chair at Vantage Secure's monitoring center and looked at her screen for a long moment before she said anything. Then, she called her director, and said that they needed to have a conversation about the Meridian Tower contract, and about a man named Calvin Reese. And about the significant gap between what their team had been doing for the past 2 hours and what he had done from a kitchen table in 40 minutes. Elaine Marsh arrived at Calvin's apartment at 2:15 p.m. She had not sent an assistant, she had not called ahead, beyond the facility's director's call that morning. She drove herself, in the same car she used for the 15-minute commute she usually spent reviewing briefing documents on her phone. She sat in the car outside the building for a moment before going in. The building was a 6-story walk-up in a neighborhood that was not far from the financial district in distance, and a significant remove from it in everything else. The kind of building where the buzzers on half the units still had handwritten name labels, and where the lobby smelled like the previous night's cooking from 3 different apartments. She found the apartment number from the HR file her assistant had pulled. She walked to the 3rd floor. She knocked. Calvin opened the door in the same gray coveralls he had been wearing for 53 hours, now slept in for another 3. He had clearly just woken up again his eyes carried the particular unfocused quality of someone whose body is still negotiating the return to consciousness. He looked at her without surprise. Not because he had expected her specifically, but because he had reached a state of tiredness beyond which most surprises require more energy than he currently had. Behind him, visible through the apartment doorway, was a kitchen table with a laptop, a chessboard mid-game, and a worn notebook open beside the keyboard. On the refrigerator, a child's drawing a building, tall and narrow, with small figures in the windows. Elaine looked at the drawing for a moment. Then she looked at Calvin. She did not arrange her words carefully or build toward anything gradually. "I fired you this morning before I heard a single word you said," she said. "I made that decision based on what I thought I was looking at. I was wrong. And the building my building, the people in it came within 2 hours of something I don't want to describe out loud." Calvin leaned against the door frame. He said nothing. "I owe you an apology," Elaine said, "and I owe you considerably more than that. But the apology comes first." Calvin looked at her for a long moment, the particular look of someone taking the measure of whether a thing is being said because it is true or because it is useful. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table. Calvin moved the chessboard to make room. Elaine looked at it briefly. "Is this yours?" she asked. "My son's," Calvin said. "He's 9. He's better than me. I'm working on it." Something shifted in Elaine's expression, small, but present. She asked about the attack. Not in the language of crisis management or liability she had people for that but with the specific curiosity of someone who has just discovered a significant gap in their understanding of something they believed they used. Understood. Calvin explained it from the elevator module vulnerability. The lateral movement, the 6 footholds, the 53 hours, the reboot, the credential rotation. He explained it in language that was precise without being condescending the instinct of someone who has spent years translating technical reality for people who needed to understand it without necessarily needing to replicate it. Elaine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Vantage Secure has been contracted to protect that building for 4 years, she said. "They didn't find this. they would have, Calvin said. Eventually, the attack had been running for 3 weeks, it might have been another week, maybe 2, but you found it in 40 minutes. Calvin looked at the chessboard. I read the documentation, he said. The proposal Elaine put on the table minus through her legal team, formally 4 days after the kitchen table conversation minus was not a settlement. It was not a severance package with a non-disclosure agreement attached. It was a job offer. Head of Building Cybersecurity, Meridian Property Group. A newly created role, because the role had not previously existed minus not because the need hadn't been there, but because nobody had previously understood that the need was there. The salary was significant. The mandate was broad, full authority to assess and redesign the cybersecurity architecture of every building in Meridian's portfolio minus 11 properties, all running some version of the smart building technology that the Meridian Tower had pioneered. Calvin read the offer letter at his kitchen table. Darius was doing homework beside him, the chessboard set up between them in the configuration they had been working through for a week. Darius looked at the letter without reading it. He looked at his father's face. "Is it good?" Darius asked. "It's good," Calvin said. "Are you going to take it?" Calvin looked at the chessboard. He looked at the configuration, minus the defense problem Darius had been working on, the one Mrs. Patterson had said he'd solved while Calvin was at the building. He looked at the position for a moment. "What was the defense move?" he said. "The one you figured out." Darius pointed at a piece without hesitation. The move was quiet, undramatic, a single step that didn't look like much from the outside minus, but which Calvin, looking at the board, could see would make the position impenetrable within 3 moves. Not a flashy move, not the obvious move, the correct one. "Yay," Calvin said. "I'm going to take it." The federal investigation into the Meridian Tower attack took 4 months. The attack was traced to a group that had been targeting smart building infrastructure across the eastern seaboard minus the Meridian Tower had been one of 7 targets, the only one where the intrusion had been detected and neutralized before the active phase. The investigation's technical report, submitted to the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Division, included a section on the response methodology that Calvin had employed minus the manual mapping, the disguised closures, the legacy pathway, the credential rotation. The section was 3 pages long. Its author, a federal cybersecurity analyst with 20 years of experience, described Calvin's approach as a textbook response to an advanced persistent threat, executed without institutional resources, standard tooling or any support structure, by a single individual operating on direct technical knowledge and documented system familiarity. The report's author had asked during the investigation whether Calvin had received formal cybersecurity training. Calvin had said that he'd had 2 years of coursework, a long time ago. That mostly. He had read the documentation. The analyst had looked at him for a moment and then written, in the margin of his interview notes in handwriting that Calvin would not see until the report was published, reads the documentation. Remembers what he reads, acts on what he understands. He had underlined it. On the first morning of his new job, Calvin arrived at the Meridian Tower at 7 a.m. He wore a different jacket. A blue one, not coveralls. His name was not on the chest. He badged through the main entrance minus the same entrance he had used for 6 years on a facilities badge, minus, and took the elevator to the 38th floor, where Meridian Property Group's executive offices occupied the northeast corner. He had an office now. A small one, which he had not yet furnished beyond a desk and a chair, because he had not yet decided what should go in it. On the desk was a notepad, a laptop and a cup of coffee he had brought from the cart in the lobby minus the same cart he had passed every morning for 6 years. On his way to the service entrance he sat down. He opened the laptop. He pulled up the NextCore administrative interface for all 11 Meridian properties. He had 11 buildings to read. He started with the documentation. At 3:45 that afternoon, Darius was picked up from school by Mrs. Patterson, who told him his dad was at his new job and would be home by 6. Darius said okay. He asked if Mrs. Patterson knew what his dad's new job was. Patterson said she wasn't entirely sure, something with computers and buildings. Darius considered this for a moment with the evaluating calm of a 9-year-old processing new information against existing data. He reads everything, Darius said. He always knows things nobody else knows because he reads everything. Even the boring stuff. Mrs. Patterson said that sounded about right. Darius said it was actually a really good strategy, and that he had been thinking about using it more in chess. He opened his backpack and took out the chessboard and began setting up the pieces on Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table with the quiet focus of someone starting a problem. They already know how to solve minus because they had done the reading, and they had done it carefully. And what other people called boring, they had learned to call an advantage. Outside, the Meridian Tower caught the late afternoon light across 54 floors of glass and steel minus, and inside it, on the 38th floor, a man who had once mopped its hallways at 3 in the morning was building the thing that would make sure it never went dark again. Some people read the manual. Most people don't. The difference, it turns out, is not a small one.